Hello and welcome to Shadow of Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation. Over a warm cup of coffee today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes, mystery filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable and let's unravel the case together, and if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in. From now, let's get started. Sherlock Holmes, The Copper Beeches Mystery, A House of Hidden Horrors. Chapter 1. The Peculiar Advertisement. The rain pattered softly against the windows of 221B Baker Street, a steady rhythm that seemed to mirror the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the fire. Across from him, Dr. Watson scribbled notes in his journal, occasionally glancing up at his friend as if waiting for some remark or observation. The silence was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression one of mild curiosity. "A young lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "She seems rather distressed." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Show her in, Mrs. Hudson. Distress often brings the most intriguing cases." A moment later, a woman stepped into the room. She was tall and slender, with an air of quiet determination, though her hands clasped and unclasped nervously. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice steady despite her obvious anxiety, "my name is Violet Hunter. I find myself in need of your advice regarding a most peculiar situation." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Please sit down, Miss Hunter. Tell us everything, and omit no detail, however trivial it may seem." Violet took a deep breath and began her tale. "I am a governess by profession, Mr. Holmes. Recently, I responded to an advertisement in the Times for a position at a country estate called the Copper Beeches. The offer was generous, far more so than is typical for such a role. The salary was double what I usually earn, and the conditions seemed unusual." "Unusual in what way?" Holmes interjected, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The employer, a Mr. Geoffrey Rucastle, specified that I must cut my hair short and wear a particular blue dress he would provide. He also insisted that I sit in a specific chair by the window at certain times of the day. When I expressed my confusion, he assured me that these requests were merely to please his wife, who had certain whims." Watson leaned forward, pen poised. "Did you find these demands alarming, Miss Hunter?" "I did, Dr. Watson," she replied, "but I am in need of employment, and the salary was too tempting to refuse outright. Still, I felt uneasy. I decided to seek your counsel before making a decision." Holmes rose from his chair and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Miss Hunter, did Mr. Rucastle provide any explanation for these peculiar conditions? Did he mention anything about the household or the estate itself?" Violet hesitated. "He spoke of his wife's delicate nerves and their young child, who required careful supervision. But there was something off about his manner. He was overly insistent, almost desperate, as if he feared I might decline the offer." Holmes stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Your instincts are sound, Miss Hunter. There is indeed something amiss here. The conditions you describe are not merely eccentric. they suggest a deeper, more sinister purpose. Watson frowned. But what could that purpose be, Holmes? Why would a man demand such specific and unusual behaviour from a governess? Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. That, my dear Watson, is the question we must answer. Miss Hunter, I advise you to accept the position, but on one condition. And what is that, Mr. Holmes? That you keep me informed of everything that occurs at the Copper Beeches. Write to me daily, no matter how trivial the details may seem. And if you sense any danger, send for me at once. Violet nodded, her resolve firming. I will, Mr. Holmes, thank you. As she rose to leave, Holmes added, One more thing, Miss Hunter. Be cautious. Trust no one entirely, not even those who seem kind. The door closed behind her, and Watson turned to Holmes. Do you truly believe she is walking into danger? Holmes returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. I do, Watson. The Copper Beeches hold secrets. Secrets someone is willing to go to great lengths to conceal. And Miss Hunter may be the key to unlocking them. The fire crackled in, the hearth casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the rain continued to fall, as if the very heavens were weeping for what lay ahead. Chapter 2. The Unusual Conditions. The morning sun cast a pale light over the bustling streets of London, as Violet Hunter made her way to Waterloo Station. Her trunk had been sent ahead, and she carried only a small valise, her mind still turning over the conversation with Sherlock Holmes. His words echoed in her thoughts. Trust no one entirely. She squared her shoulders, determined to heed his advice. The train ride to Hampshire was uneventful, the countryside rolling past in a blur of green fields and distant hills. Violet spent the journey rehearsing her story, preparing herself for the role she was about to play. By the time the train pulled into the small station nearest to the Copper Beeches, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. A carriage awaited her, its driver a surly man with a weather-beaten face who offered no greeting beyond a curt nod. Violet climbed in, and the horses set off at a brisk pace, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against the road filling the silence. The Copper Beeches estate came into view as the carriage rounded a bend. The house was an imposing structure, its gabled roof and ivy-covered walls giving it an air of faded grandeur. The name, Violet realized, came from the two massive copper beech trees that flanked the entrance, their twisted branches casting long shadows across the gravel drive. As the carriage came to a halt, the front door opened and a man stepped out. He was of medium height, with a florid complexion and a jovial smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Hunter, he exclaimed, extending a hand to help her down. Welcome to the Copper Beeches. I am Jeffro Rucastle. We are delighted to have you here. Violet forced a smile, noting the firmness of his grip. Thank you, Mr. Rucastle. I am eager to begin my duties. Splendid, splendid, he said, leading her inside. My wife, Alice, is most anxious to meet you. She has been unwell, you see, and your presence will be a great comfort to her. The interior of the house was as grand as its exterior, though there was an air of neglect. Dust clung to the corners of the ornate furniture, and the heavy drapes seemed to swallow the sunlight. Violet followed Rucastle into a dimly lit drawing-room, where a woman sat by the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Alice, my dear," Rucastle said, his tone softening. "This is Miss Hunter, our new governess." Mrs. Rucastle looked up, her face pale and drawn. She offered a faint smile, but her eyes were distant, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. "Welcome, Miss Hunter," she murmured. "I hope you will be happy here." "Thank you, Mrs. Rucastle," Violet replied, sensing the woman's unease. Rucastle clapped his hands together, breaking the tension. "Now, Miss Hunter, let me show you to your room. We have much to discuss regarding your duties." He led her up a sweeping staircase to a spacious bedroom on the second floor. The room was comfortably furnished, with a large window overlooking the grounds. Violet noticed a blue dress laid out on the bed, its fabric shimmering in the sunlight. "Yes," Rucastle said, following her gaze. "The dress. I trust it will fit you. You are to wear it whenever you are in the company of my wife. It is a preference of hers." Violet nodded, though her unease grew. "Of course, Mr. Rucastle." "Excellent," he said, his smile widening. "Now, there is one more thing. Each afternoon you are to sit in the drawing-room by the window. My wife enjoys watching you from her chair. It brings her comfort." Violet's mind raced. Holmes's warning echoed in her ears. "May I ask why, Mr. Rucastle?" His jovial demeanour faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "As I mentioned, my wife has been unwell. She finds solace in routine. I trust you will not find this too burdensome." "Not at all," Violet replied, though her instincts screamed otherwise. "Good, good," Rucastle said, clapping his hands again. "I shall leave you to settle in. Dinner is at 7. Do join us in the dining room." As the door closed behind him, Violet let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She crossed to the window, gazing out at the sprawling grounds. The copper beech trees swayed in the breeze, their leaves whispering secrets she could not yet decipher. Her eyes fell on a wing of the house that seemed darker, more foreboding than the rest. The windows were shuttered, and no light escaped from within. A chill ran down her spine as she recalled Holmes's words. The Copper Beeches hold secrets. Violet turned away from the window, her resolve hardening. She would play her part, but she would not be blind to the dangers around her. Reaching into her valise, she pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. "Dear Mr. Holmes, I have arrived at the Copper Beeches. The conditions are as strange as I feared. Mr. Rucastle insists I wear a specific dress and sit by the window each afternoon. There is a locked wing of the house that fills me with unease. I will keep you informed of everything I observe. Yours sincerely, Violet Hunter." Folding the letter, she tucked it into her pocket, determined to post it at the first opportunity. The mystery of the Copper Beeches was deepening, and Violet knew she was walking a dangerous path. Chapter 3. Holmes's Deductions. Back at 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat at his desk. The letter from Violet Hunter spread before him. His keen eyes scanned the words, absorbing every detail. Dr. Watson, seated across from him, watched with growing curiosity. "Well, Holmes," Watson asked, unable to contain himself any longer, "what do you make of Miss Hunter's letter?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "It is as I suspected, Watson. The Copper Beeches is no ordinary estate, and Mr. Geoffrey Rucastle is no ordinary employer." Watson frowned. But what could be the purpose of these strange demands? The dress, the sitting by the window, it all seems so theatrical." "Precisely," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming. "Theatricality often conceals a deeper motive. Consider the facts. Miss Hunter is asked to cut her hair, wear a specific dress, and sit in a particular spot at certain times. These are not mere whims. They are calculated actions designed to create an illusion." "An illusion of what?" Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his movements quick and precise. "Imagine, Watson, a woman with auburn hair, wearing a blue dress, sitting by a window. To an outside observer, she might resemble someone else entirely, someone whom Mr. Rucastle wishes to deceive." Watson's eyes widened. "You mean Miss Hunter is being used as a decoy?" "Exactly," Holmes said, stopping abruptly. "But the question remains, who is the intended audience for this charade, and why?" Watson leaned forward, his pen poised over his notebook. "What of the locked wing of the house? Miss Hunter mentioned it in her letter." Holmes's expression darkened. "Ah, yes, the locked wing. That is the most troubling detail of all. A house with a forbidden section is a house with secrets. Secrets that someone is desperate to keep hidden." "But what could be hidden there?" Watson pressed. Holmes shook his head. "That, my dear Watson, is what we must uncover. For now, we can only speculate. But one thing is certain. Miss Hunter is in grave danger. The sooner we act, the better." Watson set down his pen. "Should we not go to the Copper Beeches at once?" Holmes hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window. "Not yet. Miss Hunter is our eyes and ears within the house. If we intervene too soon, we risk alerting Rucastle to our suspicions. No, we must wait for her next communication. In the meantime, I will make some inquiries of my own." "Inquiries? Indeed," Holmes said, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I have a network of informants who may shed light on the Rucastle family and their peculiar habits. There is more to this mystery than meets the eye, Watson. Much more." Watson nodded, though his unease was evident. "I hope you're right, Holmes. For Miss Hunter's sake." Holmes returned to his desk, his mind already racing ahead. He picked up the letter and read it once more, his sharp eyes lingering on the final lines. "There is a locked wing of the house that fills me with unease." "Watson," he said abruptly, "make a note of this. The locked wing is the key to the mystery. Whatever lies within those walls holds the answer to Rucastle's motives, and I intend to uncover it." Watson scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. "Do you think Miss Hunter will be safe until then?" Holmes's expression softened, a rare hint of concern flickering in his eyes. "She is a resourceful woman, Watson, but we must be prepared to act swiftly if the situation demands it. For now, we wait and watch." The room fell silent, the weight of the mystery hanging heavy in the air. Outside, the streets of London buzzed with life, but within, the confines of 221B Baker Street, the focus was on a distant estate and the secrets it held. Chapter 4. The Copper Beeches Estate. The days at the Copper Beeches settled into a strange, unsettling rhythm for Violet Hunter. Each morning she dressed in the blue gown provided by Mr. Rucastle, its fabric cool and unfamiliar against her skin. She spent her afternoon seated by the drawing-room window, the sunlight streaming in as Mrs. Rucastle watched her with hollow eyes. The child, a quiet boy of 6 named Edward, clung to his mother's side, his gaze darting nervously between Violet and the locked wing of the house. The locked wing. It loomed in Violet's thoughts like a shadow, its shuttered windows and barred doors a constant reminder of the mysteries hidden within. She had tried to broach the subject with Mr. Rucastle, but he had brushed her questions aside with a laugh that rang hollow. "Oh, that old wing," he had said, his jovial tone strained. "Nothing but storage, my dear. Dust and cobwebs, nothing more." But Violet wasn't convinced. She had seen the way his eyes flickered when she mentioned it, the way his hands clenched and unclenched, as if suppressing some deep-seated fear. One evening after dinner, Violet found herself alone in the drawing-room. The Rucastles had retired early, and the house was eerily quiet. She sat by the fire, a book in her lap, though her attention was elsewhere. Her thoughts turned to Sherlock Holmes and the letter she had posted earlier that day. She hoped it would reach him soon. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible creak, like the groan of a floorboard underfoot. Violet froze, her heart pounding. The sound had come from the direction of the locked wing. She rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, and crossed to the door. The hallway beyond was dark, the only light coming from the flickering fire behind her. She hesitated, then stepped into the shadows, her breath shallow. The sound came, again louder this time, followed by a low, muffled thud. Violet's pulse quickened as she crept down the hallway, her hand brushing the wall for guidance. The air grew colder the closer she got to the locked wing, and a faint, acrid smell reached her nostrils, something metallic, like rust or blood. She stopped before the heavy oak door that barred entry to the wing. The lock was old but sturdy, the keyhole dark and unyielding. Violet pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear. For a moment there was nothing. Then a faint whisper, so soft she might have imagined it. "Help!" Violet's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, her mind racing. The voice had been faint, almost inaudible, but it had been real. Someone or something was behind that door. She turned and hurried back to the drawing-room, her thoughts a whirlwind. She needed to act, but how? The Rucastles were clearly hiding something, and confronting them directly would only put her in greater danger. As she sat by the fire, her hands trembling, a plan began to form. She would wait for Holmes's reply, but in the meantime, she would gather as much information as she could. The locked wing held the key to the mystery, and she was determined to uncover its secrets. The next morning, Violet rose early and made her way to the kitchen, where the household staff were preparing breakfast. The cook, a stout woman with a kind face, greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Hunter. You're up early." "Yes," Violet replied, forcing a smile. "I thought I might explore the grounds before my duties begin. The estate is so beautiful." The cook nodded, though her expression grew sombre. "Aye, it's a grand old place, but there are parts of it best left alone, if you take my meaning." Violet's interest piqued. "What do you mean?" The cook glanced over her shoulder, as if ensuring they were alone. "The locked wing, miss. Strange things happen there. Voices in the night, lights where there shouldn't be. The master says it's nothing, But we know better." Violet leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Have you ever seen anything? Heard? Anything?" The cook hesitated, then shook her head. "Not me, miss, but others have. Best not to ask too many questions, though. The master doesn't like it." Violet nodded, her mind racing. The staff's fear was palpable, and it only deepened her resolve. She thanked the cook and left the kitchen, her thoughts focused on the locked wing and the voice she had heard. As she stepped outside into the crisp morning air, she noticed a figure standing beneath one of the copper beech trees. It was Mr. Rucastle, his back to her, his posture tense. He seemed to be speaking to someone, though Violet could see no one else around. She moved closer, careful to stay hidden behind the tree's thick trunk. Rucastle's voice carried on the breeze, low and urgent. "It must be done tonight," he said. "We cannot risk her finding out." Violet's heart pounded as she strained to hear more, but Rucastle turned abruptly and strode back toward the house. She remained hidden, her mind racing. What must be done tonight, and who is her? The mystery of the Copper Beeches was deepening, and Violet knew she was running out of time. Chapter 5. The Locked Wing. The day passed in a blur for Violet Hunter. She went through the motions of her duties, supervising young Edward, sitting by the window in the blue dress, and enduring Mrs. Rucastle's silent scrutiny. But her mind was elsewhere. The voice from the locked wing, the cook's cryptic warnings, and Mr. Rucastle's hushed conversation under the copper beech tree swirled in her thoughts like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. As evening fell, the house grew quiet once more. The Rucastles retired to their rooms, and Violet found herself alone in the dimly lit drawing-room. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the locked wing. The shuttered windows seemed to stare back at her like blind eyes, hiding secrets she was determined to uncover. She had decided to act. Violet rose from her chair and moved silently through the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. She carried a candle, its flame trembling in the cool night air. The hallway leading to the locked wing was darker than she remembered, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. She paused before the heavy oak door, her heart pounding in her chest. Lock was old, but Violet had come prepared. Earlier that day, she had discreetly borrowed a set of keys from the housekeeper's pantry. She fumbled with them now, her hands shaking as she tried each one in turn. The third key slid into the lock with a soft click, and the door creaked open. A rush of cold air greeted her, carrying with it the same metallic smell she had noticed before. Violet stepped inside, holding the candle aloft. The room was vast and cluttered, filled with dusty furniture and crates stacked haphazardly against the walls. But it was the far corner of the room that drew her attention. A narrow staircase led downward, its steps worn and uneven. Violet hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the memory of the faint whisper, "Help!" pushed her forward. She descended the stairs, the candlelight casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder with each step, and the metallic smell grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a dimly lit corridor. Doors lined the walls, their iron bars rusted and grim. This was no storage room. It was a prison. Violet's breath quickened as she approached the first door. She peered through the bars, her candle illuminating a small, barren cell. It was empty, but the sight of it sent a chill down her spine. She moved to the next cell, and the next, each one as desolate as the last. Then she reached the final cell. A figure huddled in the corner, wrapped in a tattered blanket. Violet's candlelight fell on a pale, gaunt face, a woman, her hair matted and her eyes wide with fear. Who are you?" the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Violet's heart ached at the sight. "My name is Violet Hunter," she said softly. "I'm here to help you. Who are you?" The woman hesitated, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Alice Rucastle." Violet's blood ran cold. "Alice Rucastle? But that's impossible. Mrs. Rucastle is upstairs." The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, that woman is an impostor. She took my place. My husband, he locked me down here. He said I was mad, but I'm not. I'm not." Violet's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was horrifying. The woman upstairs, the one who called herself Mrs. Rucastle, was a fraud. The real Alice Rucastle had been imprisoned here, hidden away while her husband carried out some sinister scheme. "We need to get you out of here," Violet said, her voice firm despite her fear. "Can you walk?" Alice nodded weakly. "Yes, but he'll come after us. He'll never let me go." Violet reached through the bars, gripping Alice's hand. "We'll find a way. I have friends who can help, but we must act quickly." She turned to the door, searching for a way to open it. The lock was heavy and rusted, but she remembered the keys she had brought. She tried each one in turn, her hands trembling with urgency. The fourth key turned with a loud click, and the door swung open. Alice staggered to her feet, leaning heavily on Violet for support. Together, they made their way back up the stairs, the candlelight flickering as they moved. Violet's mind raced with plans. She would need to get Alice out of the house, but how? The estate was isolated, and Mr. Rucastle would surely notice her absence. As they reached the top of the stairs, a sound froze them in their tracks, the unmistakable creak of a floorboard. Violet extinguished the candle, plunging them into darkness. "Says Hunter?" Mr. Rucastle's voice echoed through the corridor, cold and menacing. "What are you doing here?" Violet's heart pounded as she pressed a finger to her lips, signalling Alice to stay silent. They crouched behind a stack of crates, their breaths shallow. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. Violet's mind raced. If they were discovered, there was no telling what Rucastle might do. Then, from somewhere in the house, a loud crash shattered the silence. Rucastle cursed under his breath and hurried away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Violet let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "We need to move, now!" She helped Alice to her feet, and they crept through the shadows, their movements quick and silent. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant ticking of a clock. As they reached the front door, Violet hesitated. Where could they go? The estate was miles from the nearest town, and the night was dark and cold. Then she remembered the carriage house. If they could reach it unnoticed, they might find a way to escape. "This way," she whispered, leading Alice across the grounds. The night air was crisp, the moon hidden behind a veil of clouds. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the grass. The carriage house loomed ahead, its doors slightly ajar. Violet pushed the doors open, her heart leaping with hope. But as they stepped inside, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the darkness. "Going somewhere, Miss Hunter?" It was Mr. Rucastle. Chapter 6. The shadow in the window. Violet's breath caught in her throat as Mr. Rucastle stepped into the dim light of the carriage house. His jovial demeanour was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare that sent a shiver down her spine. Beside her, Alice Rucastle trembled, her grip on Violet's arm tightening. "Mr. Rucastle," Violet said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "This is not what it seems." Rucastle's lips curled into a humourless smile. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it seems, Miss Hunter. You've been meddling in matters that don't concern you." Violet took a step back, her mind racing. She needed to buy time, to think of a way out. "I was merely exploring the house. I didn't mean to—" "Spare me your lies," Rucastle interrupted, his voice sharp. "I know what you've seen, and I know what you've done." He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. Violet glanced around the carriage house, searching for an escape route. The doors behind them were still ajar, but Rucastle blocked the path to the main house. The only other exit was a small side door, partially hidden behind a stack of crates. "Alice," Violet whispered, her voice barely audible, "when I say so, run for the door." Alice nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Rucastle's smile widened, as if he could sense their desperation. "You think you can escape?" "This is my estate, Miss Hunter. There's nowhere to run." Violet's hand tightened around the candle holder she still carried. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was all she had. She met Rucastle's gaze, her voice firm. "You won't get away with this. People will come looking for us." Rucastle chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Who, exactly?" "The staff. They're loyal to me. Your friends in London. By the time they realize you're missing, it will be too late." He took another step forward, and Violet knew she had to act. "Now!" she shouted, shoving Alice towards the side door. Rucastle lunged, but Violet swung the candle holder with all her strength. It struck his shoulder, causing him to stagger back with a grunt of pain. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. She turned and ran after Alice, her heart pounding in her chest. The side door led to a narrow path that wound around the back of the house. Violet grabbed Alice's hand, pulling her along as they raced through the darkness. The moon broke through the clouds, casting a pale light over the grounds. "Where are we going?" Alice gasped, her voice trembling. "The stables," Violet replied. "If we can reach the horses, we might have a chance." They ran across the lawn, their footsteps muffled by the grass. The stables loomed ahead, their doors slightly ajar. Violet pushed them open, her eyes scanning the dim interior. "There," she said, pointing to a horse tethered in the corner. "We'll take that one." Alice hesitated. I don't know how to ride." "You'll have to learn quickly," Violet said, already untying the horse. She helped Alice onto its back, then climbed up behind her. As they urged the horse forward, a shout echoed across the grounds. Violet glanced back to see Rucastle emerging from the carriage house, his face twisted with rage. "Stop them!" he bellowed, his voice carrying on the night air. The horse surged forward, its hooves pounding against the earth. Violet held on tightly, her mind racing. They needed to reach the main road to find help. But the estate was vast, and the night was dark. As they galloped through the grounds, a figure stepped into their path. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the shadows. Violet's heart leapt into her throat, but then the man spoke, his voice calm and familiar. "Miss Hunter, I see you've been busy." Violet reined in the horse, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mr. Holmes!" Sherlock Holmes stepped into the moonlight, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Behind him stood Dr. Watson, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "We received your letter," Holmes said, his gaze flicking to Alice, "and it seems we arrived just in time." Violet dismounted, her legs trembling with exhaustion. "Mr. Holmes, this is Alice Rucastle, the real Alice Rucastle. Her husband has been keeping her prisoner." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "I suspected as much. Watson, take Miss Rucastle to safety. Miss Hunter and I will deal with Mr. Rucastle." Watson helped Alice down from the horse, his voice gentle. "Come with me, madam. You're safe now." As Watson led Alice away, Holmes turned to Violet. "You've done well, Miss Hunter, but the night is not yet over." Violet nodded, her resolve hardening. "What do we do now?" Holmes's eyes gleamed in the moonlight. "Now, we confront Mr. Rucastle and uncover the truth behind this house of horrors." Chapter 7. A Cry for Help. The grounds of the Copper Beeches were eerily silent as Sherlock Holmes and Violet Hunter made their way back toward the house. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. Violet's heart still raced from their narrow escape, but Holmes's calm demeanour steadied her nerves. "Stay close," Holmes murmured, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened windows of the house. "Rucastle is desperate, and desperate men are unpredictable." Angela nodded, her grip tightening on the small knife she had taken from the stables. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sense of security. "What's the plan, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on the drawing-room window. A faint light flickered behind the curtains, and the silhouette of a figure moved across the room. "We need evidence," Holmes said quietly. "Proof of Rucastle's crimes. Without it, he could easily spin a tale to exonerate himself." "What about Alice?" Violet asked. "Her testimony will be dismissed if Rucastle claims." "She's mad," Holmes interrupted. "No, we need something more concrete, something that leaves no room for doubt." Violet's mind raced. The locked wing. That's where he kept her. There must be something there. Documents, records, anything that proves his guilt. Holmes nodded. "Precisely. But we must move quickly. Rucastle will know we're here, and he won't hesitate to destroy any evidence." They approached the house cautiously, sticking to the shadows. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. Holmes pushed it open silently, his movements fluid and precise. Violet followed, her senses on high alert. Interior of the house was dark, the only light coming from the flickering embers of the drawing-room fire. Holmes gestured for Violet to stay close as they moved through the hallway, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets. As they reached the locked wing, Holmes paused, his keen eyes studying the heavy oak door. The lock had been forced open, the wood splintered around the keyhole. "He's been here," Holmes murmured, "and recently." Violet's pulse quickened. "Do you think he's still inside?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the door open slowly, revealing the dimly lit corridor beyond. The air was cold and damp, the metallic smell stronger than ever. They moved down the corridor, their footsteps echoing softly. The cells were empty now, their doors hanging open. But at the far end of the corridor, a faint light spilled from an open doorway. Holmes gestured for Violet to stay back as he approached the door. He peered inside, his body tense. Then he stepped into the room, his voice low and commanding. "Mr. Rucastle, I suggest you come quietly." Violet followed, her breath catching as she saw the scene before her. Rucastle stood in the centre of the room, a lantern in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. His face was pale, his eyes wild with panic. "Holmes," Rucastle spat, his voice trembling, "you have no right to be here. This is my home." "And this," Holmes said, gesturing to the room, "is your prison, where you kept your wife locked away, hidden from the world." Rucastle's grip tightened on the papers. "You don't understand. She's mad. Dangerous. I had no choice." "No choice but to imprison her and replace her with an impostor," Holmes countered, his tone icy. "A clever scheme, Rucastle, but one that has unravelled." Rucastle's eyes darted to Violet, his expression twisting with rage. "You," he snarled, "this is your doing. You couldn't leave well enough, alone." Violet stood her ground, her voice steady. "I couldn't ignore the truth, not when an innocent woman was suffering." Rucastle let out a bitter laugh. "Innocent? You have no idea what she's capable of, what she's done." Holmes took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Rucastle. "Enlighten us, then. What has she done?" For a moment, Rucastle hesitated. Then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "It doesn't matter. You'll never prove anything." He tossed the lantern to the ground, the glass shattering as flames leapt up, consuming the papers in his hand. Holmes lunged forward, but Rucastle was already moving, darting past him and out the door. "After him!" Holmes shouted, his voice sharp. Violet didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted after Rucastle, her heart pounding as the flames spread behind her. The corridor was filled with smoke, the heat intense, but she pushed through, her eyes fixed on Rucastle's retreating figure. He reached the stairs and began to climb, his movements frantic. Violet followed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw Rucastle disappear into the drawing room. She burst into the room, her knife raised, but Rucastle was ready. He swung a heavy candlestick at her, the blow glancing off her shoulder and sending her stumbling back. "You should have stayed out of this," Rucastle growled, advancing on her. Violet scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She needed to buy time to distract him until Holmes arrived. "You'll never get away with this," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Holmes knows everything. The police will be here soon." Rucastle's eyes narrowed. "Then I'll make sure you're not around to testify." He raised the candlestick again, but before he could strike, a voice rang out from the doorway. "Drop it, Rucastle." Holmes stood in the doorway, his revolver aimed steadily at Rucastle's chest. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. Rucastle froze, his grip on the candlestick tightening. "You wouldn't dare. Try me," Holmes said, his voice cold. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension palpable. Then, with a snarl of frustration, Rucastle dropped the candlestick and raised his hands in surrender. Holmes stepped forward, his revolver never wavering. "Violet, are you all right?" She nodded, her shoulder throbbing but her resolve unshaken. "I'm fine, but the fire—" "Watson is dealing with it," Holmes said, his gaze never leaving Rucastle. "The staff have been alerted. The house will be saved." Rucastle let out a bitter laugh. "Saved? For what?" "To expose my shame to the world." "Your shame is your own doing," Holmes said, his voice sharp. "And now you will face the consequences." As Holmes secured Rucastle, Violet sank into a chair, her body trembling with exhaustion. The mystery of the Copper Beeches was unravelling, but the night was far from over. Chapter 8. Holmes and Watson. Investigate the Copper Beeches was a hive of activity as the fire in the locked wing was extinguished. The staff, roused from their quarters, worked tirelessly under Dr. Watson's direction to contain the flames. Smoke still lingered in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of burnt paper and wood. Sherlock Holmes, ever the picture of calm, had secured Geoffrey Rucastle in the drawing-room, binding his hands with a length of rope. Violet Hunter sat by the fire, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her face pale but resolute. Holmes studied her for a moment before turning his attention to Rucastle, who sat slumped in a chair, his earlier bravado replaced by a sullen silence. "Watson," Holmes called as his friend entered the room, his face smudged with soot. "How, bird, is the damage?" "Contained, thankfully," Watson replied, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. "The fire didn't spread beyond the locked wing, but much of the evidence may be lost." Holmes's lips tightened, but he nodded. "We'll make do with what remains. Rucastle's confession will be crucial, but we'll need more to ensure a conviction." Rucastle let out a derisive snort. "Confession? I've admitted to nothing." Holmes turned to him, his gaze piercing. "Your actions speak louder than words, Rucastle. Imprisoning your wife, fabricating her identity, and attempting to destroy evidence. These are not the deeds of an innocent man." Rucastle's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Watson approached Violet, his expression softening. "How are you holding up, Miss Hunter?" "I've been better," Violet admitted with a faint smile. "But I'll manage. Thank you, Dr. Watson." Holmes began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "We must act quickly. Rucastle's accomplice, the woman posing as Mrs. Rucastle, is still at large. She may attempt to flee or destroy further evidence." "Where is Alice?" Violet asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Safe," Watson assured her. "I've taken her to the village inn. She's under the care of the landlady, a trustworthy woman." Holmes stopped pacing and turned to Violet. "Miss Hunter, you've been inside the locked wing. Did you notice anything unusual? anything that might serve as evidence. Violet frowned, trying to recall the details. The cells were empty, but there was a desk in the room where Rucastle was burning papers. It had drawers. Perhaps they contained something useful. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Excellent. Watson, with me. Miss Hunter, stay here and keep an eye on Rucastle. If he tries anything, shout for help. Violet nodded, her grip tightening on the blanket. Holmes and Watson left the room, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. The locked wing was a charred mess, the walls blackened and the air thick with smoke. Holmes navigated the debris with ease, his keen eyes scanning the room. The desk Violet had mentioned was partially burnt, but the drawers appeared intact. Holmes pulled open the first drawer, revealing a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. He untied it and began to read, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. "What is it?" Watson asked, peering over his shoulder. "Blackmail," Holmes said, his voice low. "Rucastle has been extorting money from local landowners, threatening to expose their secrets. These letters detail his schemes." Watson whistled softly, enough to ruin him, and enough to ensure his conviction, Holmes said, tucking the letters into his coat. "But there's more. Look at this." He opened the second drawer, revealing a small ledger. The pages were filled with names, dates, and amounts of money. Holmes flipped through it, his eyes narrowing. "Payments," he murmured, "to the woman posing as Mrs. Rucastle. It seemed she was more than an accomplice. She was a hired actress paid to play the part." Watson shook his head in disbelief. "The depth of his deception is staggering." Holmes closed the ledger and handed it to Watson. "We'll need to find her. She may be our key to unravelling the rest of this mystery." As they left the locked wing, Holmes paused, his gaze falling on a small charred photograph lying amidst the debris. He picked it up, brushing away the soot to reveal the image of a young woman with auburn hair and piercing eyes. "Alice," Watson said, recognizing her immediately. Holmes studied the photograph, his expression thoughtful. "There's more to this story than we've uncovered. Rucastle's motives run deeper than greed." They returned to the drawing room, where Violet still sat vigil over Rucastle. Holmes held up the photograph. "Who is she, Rucastle? The real Alice? What did she do to deserve such cruelty?" Rucastle's face paled, but he remained silent. Holmes stepped closer, his voice cold and relentless. "You can tell us now, or you can tell the court, but one way or another, the truth will come out." For a long moment, Rucastle said nothing. Then, with a defeated sigh, he slumped forward in his chair. "She knew," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She knew everything." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Knew what?" Rucastle looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. "About the child, about Edward. He's not mine." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Violet's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Holmes leaned in, his voice sharp. "Explain." Rucastle's shoulders sagged, his defiance crumbling. "Alice had an affair. Edward is the result. I couldn't bear the shame, the humiliation, so I locked her away and replaced her with a woman who would play the part of the dutiful wife. I thought I could erase the past, but she wouldn't let me. She kept writing letters, threatening to expose me if I didn't release her. Dintelton straightened, his expression grim. And so you kept her prisoner, hoping to silence her forever. Rucastle said nothing, his silence confirmation enough. Holmes turned to Watson and Violet, his voice firm. "We have what we need. Watson, fetch the local constable. It's time to bring this matter to a close." As Watson left the room, Violet rose from her chair, her eyes fixed on Rucastle. "You're a monster," she said, her voice trembling. With anger, Rucastle didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the floor. Holmes placed a hand on Violet's shoulder. "Justice will be served, Miss Hunter, but our work here is not yet done. The impostor is still out there, and we must find her before she disappears." Violet nodded, her resolve hardening. "What do you need me to do?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "Stay with Watson. Ensure Rucastle is handed over to the authorities. I'll handle the search." As Holmes left the room, Violet sank back into her chair, her mind racing. The mystery of the Copper Beeches was unravelling, but the final pieces were still missing. Chapter 9. The Truth Behind the Locked Door. The first light of dawn crept over the Copper Beeches estate, casting a pale glow over the charred remains of the locked wing. Sherlock Holmes stood in the drawing-room, his sharp eyes scanning the room, as if it held secrets yet to be uncovered. Violet Hunter sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Dr. Watson kept a watchful eye on Jeffro Rucastle, who sat bound and silent in a corner. The local constable had arrived shortly after Watson's summons, and Rucastle had been taken into custody. But the woman who had posed as Mrs. Rucastle was still missing, her whereabouts unknown. Holmes had spent the early hours of the morning questioning the staff, but none had seen her since the fire broke out. "She couldn't have gone far," Watson said, breaking the silence. "The estate is isolated and the roads are few." Holmes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "True, but she is resourceful, and she knows the grounds better than we do. We must act quickly." Violet rose from her chair, her face pale but determined. "Mr. Holmes, there's something I haven't told you. When I was in the locked wing, I saw a map in one of the desk drawers. It showed a network of tunnels beneath the estate." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Tunnels? That changes everything. Where do they lead?" "I'm not sure," Violet admitted, "but one of the passages was marked with an X. It could be a hiding place, or an escape route." Holmes turned to Watson. "Gather the staff. We'll need their help to search the grounds. Miss Hunter, come with me. We'll start in the cellar." The cellar of the Copper Beeches was a dark, damp space filled with crates and barrels. Holmes lit a lantern, its flickering light casting long shadows on the stone walls. Violet followed close behind, her heart pounding as they descended the narrow stairs. "The map indicated an entrance here," Violet said, her voice barely above a whisper. Holmes scanned the walls, his keen eyes missing nothing. "There," he said, pointing to a section of the wall that seemed slightly recessed. He pressed his hand against the stone, and with a soft click, a hidden door swung open. Beyond the door was a narrow passage, its walls lined with moss and its air thick with the scent of earth. Holmes stepped inside, the lantern held high. Violet followed, her breath shallow as they moved deeper into the tunnel. The passage twisted and turned, its walls closing in around them. After several minutes, they reached a fork in the tunnel. Holmes paused, his gaze flicking between the two paths. "Which way?" Violet asked, her voice trembling. Holmes knelt, examining the ground. The left passage shows signs of recent use. Footprints in the dirt. She went this way. They followed the left passage, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. Finally, they reached a small chamber, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty bottles and jars. In the center of the chamber stood the impostor, her back to them as she rifled through a stack of papers. She turned at the sound of their footsteps, her eyes widening in surprise. "You!" she hissed, her voice filled with venom. "You ruined everything." Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "It's over. Rucastle is in custody, and your charade has come to an end." The woman's eyes darted to the exit, but Holmes blocked her path. "There's nowhere to run. Surrender, and you may yet receive leniency." For a moment she hesitated, her hands trembling. Then, with a cry of frustration, she lunged at Holmes, a knife glinting in her hand. Violet gasped, but Holmes was ready. He sidestepped the attack, disarming her with a swift, precise movement. The knife clattered to the ground, and Holmes pinned, her against the wall, his grip firm. "Enough," he said, his voice cold. "Your game is finished." The woman sagged in his grip, her defiance crumbling. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. "He promised me freedom, a new life, but it was all a lie." Holmes's expression softened, but his grip didn't waver. "Tell us everything, and we may yet help you." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "My name is Clara. Rucastle hired me to play the part of his wife. He said it was temporary, just until he could secure his inheritance. But then he locked Alice away, and I realized I was trapped. He threatened to ruin me if I didn't comply." Holmes released her, stepping back. "You'll need to testify against him. It's the only way to ensure justice is served." Clara nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll do whatever it takes." As they made their way back through the tunnel, Violet's mind raced. The mystery of the Copper Beeches was unraveling, but the final pieces were still falling into place. When they emerged into the cellar, Watson was waiting for them, his expression one of relief. "Holmes, Miss Hunter, are you all right?" "We're fine," Holmes replied, his voice steady. "We've found our missing accomplice. She's agreed to cooperate." Watson nodded, his gaze falling on Clara. "The constable is waiting, outside. He'll take her into custody." As Clara was led away, Violet turned to Holmes. "What happens now?" Holmes's expression was grim. "Now, we ensure that Rucastle and his accomplices face justice. But there's one more thing we must do." "What's that?" Violet asked. Holmes met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. "We must reunite Alice with her son, and we must ensure that Edward knows the truth about his father." Violet nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. The mystery of the Copper Beeches was coming to an end, but its impact would linger for years to come. Chapter 10. The rescue, the village inn, was a modest but welcoming establishment, its warm glow a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive atmosphere of the Copper Beeches. Alice Rucastle sat by the fireplace in a private room, her hands clasped tightly around a cup of tea. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but there was a glimmer of hope in them now, a fragile light that had been absent for years. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Violet Hunter entered the room, their presence drawing Alice's gaze. She rose, unsteadily to her feet, her voice trembling. "Mr. Holmes, is it over?" Holmes nodded, his expression softening. "It is, Mrs. Rucastle. Your husband and his accomplice are in custody. You are safe now." Alice sank back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Violet stepped forward, her voice gentle. "There's one more thing we need to do, Alice. We need to reunite you with Edward." Alice's breath caught, her hands trembling. "Edward, my boy. Does he know? Does he understand?" Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson before speaking. "He knows nothing yet, but he deserves the truth, and he deserves to know his mother." Alice nodded, her resolve firming. "Take me to him, please." The journey back to the Copper Beeches was a sombre one. The estate, once a place of terror for Alice, now felt strangely empty, its secrets laid bare. The staff, many of whom had been unaware of the truth, watched in silence as Alice was led to the drawing-room. Edward sat by the window, his small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the room. He looked up as they entered, his eyes wide with confusion. "Edward," Alice said, her voice breaking. "It's me, your mother." The boy stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke, the tension in the room palpable. Then, slowly, Edward rose from his chair and took a hesitant step forward. "Mamma," he whispered, his voice trembling. Alice fell to her knees, her arms outstretched. Edward ran to her, burying his face in her shoulder as she held him tightly. The room was filled with the sound of her quiet sobs, the weight of years of separation finally lifting. Holmes, Watson, and Violet stepped back, giving them space. Violet's eyes were wet with tears, but she smiled through them. "It's over," she said softly. "They're together again." Holmes nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Yes, but there is still much to be done. The legal proceedings will be lengthy, and Edward's future must be secured." Watson placed a hand on Holmes's shoulder. "We'll ensure they have the support they need. The truth has come out, and justice will be served." As they left the drawing-room, Violet turned to Holmes. "What happens now? To the estate? To Alice and Edward?" Holmes's gaze was distant, his mind already working through the details. The estate will likely be sold to settle Rucastle's debts. Alice and Edward will need to start anew, but they will not be alone. We will ensure they have the resources and support to rebuild their lives. Violet nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. "And what of us? What happens to us now that the case is closed?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "We move on to the next mystery, Miss Hunter. There is always another case, another puzzle to solve." Watson chuckled, his voice warm. "And perhaps, for now, a moment of rest. We've earned it." As they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Violet took a deep breath. the weight of the past few days lifting from her shoulders. The mystery of the Copper Beeches was over, but its impact would linger, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of truth. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The days that followed the resolution of the Copper Beeches case were a whirlwind of activity. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Violet Hunter remained at the estate to ensure that Alice and Edward were settled, and that the legal proceedings against Geoffrey Rucastle and his accomplice Clara were underway. The local constable, grateful for Holmes's assistance, had taken charge of the formalities, but Holmes's sharp mind was still needed to tie up loose ends. Alice Rucastle, though frail from her years of imprisonment, showed remarkable strength. With Violet's help, she began to reclaim her life, starting with the simple act of reconnecting with her son. Edward, initially shy and uncertain, gradually warmed to his mother, his laughter filling the halls of the Copper Beeches for the first time in years. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the estate, Holmes, Watson, and Violet gathered in the drawing-room. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the atmosphere was one of quiet reflection. "It's strange," Violet said, breaking the silence. "This house felt so oppressive when I first arrived. Now it feels different, like it's been cleansed of its darkness." Holmes nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. The weight of secrets can transform even the grandest of homes into a prison. But the truth has a way of setting things right. Watson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "What will become of the estate? It's too large for Alice and Edward to manage on their own. It will be sold," Holmes replied. "The proceeds will provide Alice and Edward with a fresh start. I've already made arrangements with a solicitor to handle the matter. They will have enough to live comfortably, far from the shadows of the past." Violet smiled, her heart swelling with relief. "I'm glad. They deserve a chance at happiness." Holmes turned to her, his expression softening. "And what of you, Miss Hunter? What are your plans now that this case is concluded?" Violet hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window. "I'm not sure. I came here seeking employment, but now I feel as though I've found something more. A purpose, perhaps." Watson chuckled. "You've certainly proven yourself to be a capable ally, Miss Hunter. Holmes and I could use someone with your resourcefulness on future cases." Holmes raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Indeed, the world is full of mysteries, and we are always in need of keen minds to help unravel them." Violet's eyes lit up with excitement. "You mean you'd allow me to assist you?" "If you're willing," Holmes said. "But be warned, the life of a detective is not without its dangers." Violet's smile widened. "I'm willing, more than willing." The room fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Outside, the first stars began to appear in the night sky, their light piercing the darkness. The following morning, Holmes, Watson, and Violet prepared to leave the Copper Beeches. Alice and Edward stood at the front door, their faces filled with gratitude. "Thank you," Alice said, her voice trembling, "for everything." Holmes inclined his head. "It was our privilege, Mrs. Rucastle. Take care of yourself, and of Edward." Edward stepped forward, his small hand clutching a folded piece of paper. He held it out to Violet. "For you." he said shyly. Violet knelt to take the paper, her heart swelling with emotion. She unfolded it to reveal a child's drawing. A house with two figures standing in front of it, their hands clasped together. "It's beautiful," Violet said, her voice thick with tears. "Thank you, Edward." The boy smiled, his eyes shining with hope. As they boarded the carriage that would take them back to London, Violet glanced back at the Copper Beeches one last time. The estate, once a place of horror, now stood as a symbol of resilience and redemption. Watson settled into his seat, his expression one of contentment. Another case solved, Holmes, and a happy ending for once. Holmes's gaze was distant, his mind already turning to the next mystery. Indeed, Watson, but the world is never without its puzzles. There is always more to uncover. Violet smiled her heart light. She had found a new path, one filled with adventure and purpose. And as the carriage rolled away from the Copper Beeches, she knew that her life would never be the same. Chapter 12. A House of Horrors. No more the Copper Beeches stood silent under the pale morning light, its ivy-covered walls and towering copper beech trees casting long shadows across the grounds. The estate, once a place of secrets and suffering, now bore the marks of renewal. Workers bustled about, clearing debris from the fire-damaged wing and preparing the house for its eventual sale. Alice Rucastle and her son, Edward, watched from a distance, their faces filled with a mixture of relief and hope. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Violet Hunter had returned to the estate one final time to ensure that all loose ends were tied. As they stepped out of the carriage, Alice approached them, her expression one of quiet gratitude. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "I cannot thank you enough for what you've done. You've given us a chance to start over." Holmes inclined his head, his tone gentle. "It was our duty, Mrs. Rucastle, but the true credit belongs to you. Your strength and resilience have carried you through." Edward tugged at Violet's sleeve, his small face serious. "Will you come back and visit us?" Violet knelt to his level, her smile warm. "Of course, Edward. And perhaps one day you'll visit us in London. There's so much to see and do there." The boy's eyes lit up with excitement, and he nodded eagerly. Watson, ever the pragmatist, turned to Alice. "Have you given any thought to where you and Edward will go?" Alice nodded. "Yes, we've decided to move to the coast. A small cottage by the sea far from here. It will be a fresh start for both of us." "A wise choice," Holmes said. "The sea has a way of washing away the past." As they walked through the grounds, Violet couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The Copper Beeches, once a house of horrors, was now a place of healing. The staff, many of whom had been unaware of the truth, had rallied around Alice and Edward, offering their support and loyalty. "It's remarkable," Violet said, her voice soft, "how something so dark can be transformed into something so full of hope." Holmes glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "The human spirit is resilient, Miss Hunter. Even in the face of great adversity, it finds a way to endure." Watson nodded in agreement. "And with the truth revealed, the shadows have been lifted. The Copper Beeches is no longer a prison, it's a home." As they reached the front gate, Alice and Edward bid them farewell, their gratitude evident in every word and gesture. Holmes, Watson, and Violet climbed into the carriage, the estate growing smaller in the distance as they drove away. The journey back to London was a quiet one, each of them lost in their thoughts. Violet gazed out the window, the countryside rolling past in a blur of green and gold. She felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a lingering curiosity. "Mr. Holmes," she said, breaking the silence, "do you think there are other cases like this? Other houses with secrets waiting to be uncovered?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "Undoubtedly, Miss Hunter. The world is full of mysteries, each one waiting for a keen mind to unravel it." Watson chuckled. "And with you on our team, I dare say we'll have no shortage of adventures." Violet's heart swelled with excitement. She had found a new purpose, a new path. And as the carriage rolled into the bustling streets of London, she knew that her life was just beginning. The mystery of the Copper Beeches was over, but its lessons would stay with her forever. The power of truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance of standing up for what was right, these were the gifts the case had given her. And as she stepped into the familiar surroundings of 221B Baker Street, Violet Hunter felt a sense of belonging. She was no longer just a governess seeking employment. She was a detective, a seeker of truth, and a protector of the innocent. The world was full of mysteries, and she was ready to face them.